Hi, this is going to be a very brief description of the post-World War II civil rights movement. This is being used for both my SBC and for my U.S. history post-1877 course, and so there's parts of it that will be more and less relevant for each group, but the baseline understanding is pretty similar. So, as titled here, really you can't understand segregation unless you understand slavery, and that is in fact the starting point for everything. For U.S. history students, they should appreciate that 1877 is the place where the course begins, right? Because 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. It's when the federal government abandons the American South, stops occupying it, and basically leaves it in a condition that white former Confederates are able to seize control of governance and everything that that entails. So it's the abandonment of Black voters, of Black civil rights, and kind of a pulling back just into the American North. And so 1877 is a really important sort of year. 1877 really marks the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Black Codes, which are sometimes also called Jim Crow, and the development of a debt peonage system in which African Americans in agricultural areas were largely kept in a cycle of debt that was basically impossible to get out of because you always owed a part of your crop every year to the same person who charged you for the renting of materials and the borrowing of seeds. So out of this condition, after post-World War II, there's all of a sudden a quickening of a civil rights movement that had been emergent all along. There had always been an African-American middle class. There had been free-born African-Americans and those who ran away out of slavery. There had been strong religious groups. There had been all sorts of labor organizations and things like that. But after World War II, things started to get quite a kickstart, and that's why we're focusing on the era. The foundations of the movement that would be the post-war movement are pretty straightforward in terms of their institutional conflicts. Okay, so the first is the NAACP, which many of you might already still be very familiar with because it's still very active in the country. The NAACP had been founded early in the century by both Black and white civil rights advocates, and its aims had shifted over time, but gradually the NAACP had become the source, the reference point for legal work and coordinating legal campaigns that were going to pull apart segregation. Another one are the labor unions, right? In particular, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters from the turn of the century had evolved into a whole variety of other union activity, including sharecropper unions. Most of the main, most powerful unions in the country restricted their membership to white men, but there were separate, distinct unions for African Americans in areas of the economy where the jobs were held almost completely by African Americans. Last one is double V campaigns. So American veterans who came home from World War II and having had the experience of not living under segregation while being deployed in Europe or in other places, and feeling very much as though they had paid a debt for which the repayment of ending segregation seemed just. They came home, right? And they were people who felt that the time had come for a change commensurate to the sacrifice they had made. Churches were a clear foundation of the movement, not just because of the guidance of liberation theology, but also because churches were pieces of real estate that were owned by African Americans where a lot of people could meet at the same time. It's not just that civil rights workers, they didn't have the option of renting spaces, right? Like if they wanted to meet as a group, churches were the only buildings to which they had access. And so the building itself was important in addition to the ideology. The Black church in the American South had also always had a particular reliance on women as leaders, because so much of the work of maintaining and structuring the church and community was done by women who controlled, for example, the schedules and knew everyone's address and knew everyone's phone number. If you want to have a mass movement, you need to know who is the person who can get other people to show up at a protest when you want to protest. And there's a pretty good chance that that's a woman in her 60s who has a critical number of kids, who has a certain amount of power in her community and who has made so many favors to other people that they all owe her in return. And then the last is the historically Black colleges and universities. HBCUs are part of an American tradition in which African Americans weren't permitted at schools that had a primarily white attendance. And so they developed a parallel sort of structure, which still exists now, in terms of producing the professionals that Black communities needed when white professionals wouldn't see Black clients. So things like doctors, dentists, morticians, attorneys, white people in those professions refused to take on Black clients, which actually created a space for African Americans to serve their community in that capacity. Okay, so these are the main institutions that are going to really channel the civil rights movement. And I'm going through them pretty quickly because we're going to look at other ones in great detail, but you need to know that it wasn't coming from nothing. Okay, so, but this still leaves open the question as well of what exactly is segregation? If you look at your packet, or if you're in U.S. history, you just look at this page. And go ahead and pause the screen and give this a read through for a second. Okay, so please pause and read this screen completely. Okay, so one of the interesting things about segregation is if you look at all of the things that are regulated here, there's a kind of micromanagement, right? Like the whole details about exactly how high the partition has to be, right? Or the idea that it's not just big things that are segregated, but like domino games or softball, right? The extent to micromanage social life in this way requires some explanation, right? Because it's not just the big things that are segregated, but the painful detail of how segregation actually worked. It was a profoundly powerful source, and it was one that used both legal, like this, and customary practices to perpetuate inequity. And the proponents of segregation used violence, threats of violence, bureaucracy, juries, police powers, educational restrictions, licensing and employment, and the occasional promise of slightly nicer segregation to keep the system going. Here, when you look at this section, what you can notice above and beyond the micromanagement is all the extent to which segregation becomes something that everyone is responsible for. So if you look at under the last paragraph that's on this page, right? Look at any person who being the owner, proprietor, keeper, or superintendent of any tavern, inn, restaurant, ball field, stadium, or other public house or public place, or the clerk, the servant, the employee of such owner, proprietor, keeper, or superintendent. Okay, so what person are we talking about here? We're talking about a white person who owns a place where people have recreation. Okay, if that white person who owns a place where people take recreation, we pick the quote back up, knowingly permits a Negro and a white person to play together or in company with each other at any game, okay, then that person shall be punished as provided in Section 4. So it wasn't just that the police were in charge of patrolling this, but that in fact individuals who happened to own businesses were in charge of enforcing segregation law. Okay, one of the reasons why I like to look at this particular Birmingham ordinance too is because to me it goes to the core of a critical aspect of segregation. People who were pro-segregation tended to argue that separation, that racial separation stopped violence from happening. That if people who were black and white were brought into contact with each other, that there would be immediately there would be instances of violence. So it was better for everybody if they were separated. And yet this attention in this case to the problem of play, right, suggests that segregation wasn't just out of a fear that people would not get along, but in fact a fear that they would, right? And I think that that's a really interesting nuance to make sure to capture. Plus, the idea that segregation is about separation, right, tends to kind of fall apart when you think about the ways in which, for example, household service was organized in much of the South. People who were white middle-class families often asked people who were African American to be live-in helpers in that family, to serve as maids and nannies and housekeepers and cooks, right? So to think that there's separation when you're living together in the same house doesn't quite work. So really it's not about a separation for fear of violence, right? It's about creating walls that made proximity comfortable, knowing about the risk that people might actually get along. Okay, so that makes segregation significantly more complicated than we might normally think about it, and certainly more complicated than it gets depicted in most popular culture. Okay, here's some here's some more of the Birmingham statutes. So go ahead and pause and look at this one too and see how this fits or departs from what we read before. Now, one of the things I should add here right off the bat is that although our focus is going to be mostly on what happens in the American South, it's not that the American North is without segregation. It just works a little differently there. Okay, as my U.S. history students should recall, right, one of the main ways that segregation works in the American North is through residential segregation. You don't, for example, really need to have school segregation if you know that homes are segregated, that Black people and white people live in different neighborhoods. Then you just say, well, this person doesn't attend this school because of their race, but because of their address. But of course, they live at that address because of their race. Okay, so the American North absolutely has its own sort of story here. So it's not getting out, free. But nonetheless, in both classes, we'll primarily be focusing on the American South. So these are some things that you should be able to explain now, right off the bat. Of the system of segregation, who was being segregated from whom? Where did segregation take place? And how was it enforced? So if you aren't clear on the answer to any of these questions, please go back and start the video over again and listen with those particular questions in mind. Okay, so 1954 was a game changer. And this is a very famous photo. It appeared in all sorts of different newspapers around the country. And 1954 is when the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education was announced. And the decision in this case made the claim that segregation in education assured that schools were inherently unequal, even if the schools were identical. That the very act of separating out, of refusing access to schools that were white to Black children was an act of discrimination regardless of how nice the school was that Black children went to. Now, in actual practice, of course, most all African American schools were not as nice as the white schools. But even if they were, the Supreme Court said, it would still be discriminatory because of how deeply the act of being told you are unwelcome can create a lifelong kind of barrier to overall success. That telling a child that that child is unwelcome, right, would carry burdens throughout adulthood. And so with that, you have this moment of legal leverage, right, where the whole concept of segregation has really become contested. Because if what segregation does is always tell people who are Black that they are constantly inferior, if that's how it works, right, then there's a real question of how it could ever be used in any particular circumstance, not just in education, but in terms of employment or housing or anything else along those lines. So that was a critical event, right, that made legally possible a lot of the new claims on government that were going to happen. But in terms of catalyzing those institutions we looked at earlier, the NAACP, the HBCU students, the women who were prominent in Black churches, right? Like in terms of catalyzing that group and bringing them together, the thing that really energized African Americans as much as anything was the death of Emmett Till. Okay, so I'm gonna have two slides on this one. The first one's very friendly. The second one is gonna be really disturbing, just to give you. So this is Emmett Till at age 14, at the age that he gets lynched. Okay, so basically Emmett Till was a young man, and he was visiting his grandfather over the summer, and he showed some friends a photo of his class in Chicago. And so he showed this group of other African American boys his class photo, which included both Black and white children. And this created a certain amount of kind of showing off, right? That Emmett Till came from a place, he was saying, where he actually knew, white boys, white girls, and they actually played together. This was so incendiary, right, in the setting where Emmett Till was located, that basically in Mississippi to make this sort of claim that any such place existed, right, was immediately challenged by the other kids who he was hanging out with. And these are all children, right? And so the boys in his group kind of challenged him to go into a local store and to greet the white woman who was a proprietor at the store. And so he went in and either did or didn't, right? This is where it gets really confusing. Simply say, "Hey, baby," in the course of making a purchase. Okay, he might have said this, he might not have. But regardless, what all of his friends in Mississippi knew, and that Emmett Till didn't really understand, was the fact that he had violated a rule that would be defended so aggressively, so disproportionately. Okay, so basically what happens is that Emmett basically gets lynched, and his body is finally found and brought back to Chicago. And his mother at his funeral makes sure to have an open casket in order to clearly demonstrate and show everybody exactly what the white people of that community had done to her child in exchange for a greeting. Okay, so this is what I'm going to show you on the next page. So if you look at the bottom right corner, that's Emmett Till after he had been dragged through the water and drowned and abused and numerous other things, right? And versus up in the left corner, you can see him in a picture with his mother, right? And Jet, the magazine in which this circulated, right, was a really popular, and still is, a really popular African-American periodical. Think of something akin to like People magazine, right? And so when seeing these images, right, it was such a clear recording, such a clear picture of exactly what had happened to this really beautiful young boy, right, one of Chicago's own, right, that it brought the whole experience of what was going on in the American South. It invested not only Chicago's African Americans, not only American Northerners overall, but it really catalyzed a whole movement, because the idea that such a thing could happen to such a little kid with so much overreaction really created the sense that people were really being hunted for this sort of thing. This is how much people cared about segregation, right? White people cared so much about segregation that they would do this to a child. And not only that, even after the murder, the people who clearly had done it, it was unequivocal, right, and had since been further confirmed, were declared not guilty by an all-white and all-male jury. Now, if you go to the Museum of African American History in the Smithsonian, Emmett Till's original coffin is actually on display. His body was eventually disinterred as part of trying to reconvict in a murder trial. Okay. So the other thing that starts to happen right around this moment is the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. So for American students, this is something that you probably know at least a little about. Even if I asked you, what year it happened in, you might be a little bit flummoxed. But nonetheless, this is really an important moment for a few different reasons. First of all, this movement goes on for like a year, okay? So we tend to think of it as like a flash in the pan. It is not. There's like a lot of mythology about this movement that's not quite right. Okay, so the deal is Rosa Parks, the woman on the left. This is not her original, photo at the time of being arrested. This is a mugshot from a little bit later, but basically she just let herself get rearrested so that she could get a really good photo we could circulate. Rosa Parks was very, very clever about PR, okay? Rosa Parks had been asked to leave the bus, okay? She had refused to give up her seat and was therefore asked to leave, and refused to leave and got arrested because she refused to give up her seat for white passengers, okay? So the context here, though, is important in ways that I want you to come out of this recognizing that Rosa Parks is a lot cooler than she's usually given credit for. Okay. In my experience, most people always imagine Rosa Parks as like 80 years old in 1955. She is not. Okay. Start with this. Okay, Rosa Parks is 42 when this goes down. I love this photo because it gives you a sense of another civil rights movement that didn't quite happen. Yes, that is Martin Luther King in the background, and we'll explain that in just a little bit. Rosa Parks went into the bus boycott not as an older woman who just simply wanted to give up her seat. Rosa Parks had already worked for the NAACP as a secretary. She had been trained at one of the legendary kind of labor rights training schools in the American South called the Highlander Folk School. She had already had an altercation previously with the same bus driver. And so when she decided to take her stand by sitting and refused to leave the bus, she deliberately chose this guy's bus because she wanted to ruin his day in particular. Okay, so when Rosa Parks does this, she's really deliberately trying to create a test case. She's trying to make sure that her behavior is exactly perfect to fit a legal challenge to the idea of segregation on public transportation. Okay, so it's not just that that particular day she was tired and decided she didn't want to give up her seat. That's a convenient narrative, right? But the truth is that Rosa Parks was a woman who planned, right? And she planned carefully. And the rest of the civil rights movement saw Rosa Parks and realized, first of all, she's adorable, okay? She is incredibly well-spoken. She dresses beautifully. And she is the kind of person you can put on a plane to California and get some serious fundraising behind your movement. And that is what was required to get this movement running, right? Rosa Parks could be an ambassador. And she understood that position and she used it very, very wisely. One of the things that we're going to focus a lot in SPC in particular is the strategic value of the right person at the right moment. And Rosa Parks was that person. But as once again, if you look at this picture, Rosa Parks was not, in fact, an old lady who was just tired and her feet hurt. I'm sure her feet did hurt. That's not the reason why she didn't get up. She didn't get up because she knew this was a fight she could eventually win. Now, when Rosa Parks takes this stand with the support of the NAACP, with great organizational strength behind her, in Montgomery, Alabama, there's a decision that there needs to be somebody who is providing a voice for the movement, as Rosa Parks is being the ambassador for the movement. And they turn to Martin Luther King Jr., not because he just seems like a nice person, because at this point he is young. He's like 30 years old, right? Like he's not somebody who's terribly established. They go to Martin Luther King Jr. because he is the son and the grandson of ministers and is the minister at one of the most important African-American churches in all of Alabama, right? He's not some guy. This is somebody who went to college when he was 16. He is a brilliant scholar and a brilliant mind who generations of people had invested deeply to create a leader like this. He didn't happen to show up. People made plans, and he was cared for and watched and trained until he was ready for exactly this sort of movement and rose to the challenge. So again, right person, right time. But when we talk about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, what's really key is the extent to which it established that it was possible to have a mass movement, that it wouldn't be a movement just of a few leaders, just of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, not a movement of just fundraising by sending Rosa Parks or King to other places to make sure that there were enough donors, that you had the checks that you needed in order to make things happen, but that it was going to be a movement that rested upon vibrant public displays of lots of people working together to demonstrate exactly how segregation undermined the dignity of the individual. And this reliance on mass movement strategies was going to be key to everything else that followed. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be concentrating on, in SPC, at least several key years between 1963 and 1965, and focusing on the American South and about the fit between nonviolent direct action tactics, right? And why that decision to use those particular tactics made sense at this time, in this place, against this sort of political rival, right? On the other hand, in U.S. history, we're going to look at this in particular as a jumping off point for a whole set of movements of liberation that are going to follow. But in the 1950s, right, in 1954, 55, 56, right, all of that still hasn't developed yet. Those big mass movements, those huge organizations like CORE and SNCC, they haven't developed yet. But who is really, really well organized are the segregations. Okay, so quick review. Why study this history? It's good to match the strategy to the movement. This is mostly for SPC. It's not always necessarily true that nonviolent direct action always works, or even that it mostly works. It's that at this particular historical moment, that it was a strategy that was perfect. And we'll go into more detail about this in SP. So in the United States now, right, this looks really different, but I want to take you into Alabama, which for those of you who are not Americans or who never memorized your states, look in the bottom right corner. It's orange. That's Montgomery, Alabama. We're going to look at a lot in Alabama because Alabama and Mississippi are especially interesting. That's why, because things happened very quickly and very vibrantly. And so I want to make sure we feel that there's a connective thread that we can follow. And Alabama, moreover, had an incredibly interesting, incredibly problematic governor. So George Wallace was elected governor of Alabama so many times, okay? Also a presidential candidate. He was somebody who had an enormous platform, and he's also somebody who you're going to see in some of the documentary footage we look at. Okay, George Wallace is important for us in these courses because he's one of the most effective mouthpieces for pro-segregation sentiment. And the fact that he is so incredibly electable suggests how widely held his understandings were. And so what you're going to do now is, if you can go to read George Wallace's Segregation Now, Segregation Forever address, I want you to take a look at it and think about what kind of document is this, right? Like, what exactly matters other than segregation at this moment? And then how exactly, like, what are the claims, what is the reasoning Wallace is providing for why he and others are morally and legally right to resist the civil rights movement, right? Because it's not something that he's trying to hide or obscure his position. And in fact, it's a position that can be yelled loudly by the elected governor of a state, right? And in that kind of environment, we want to figure out exactly how it's working. What is the logic that's being used in order to keep this idea in circulation? Okay, so that's the next thing I want you to do. Okay, go on, read the primary source, and then we'll talk about it later.